And good evening, everybody. Round of applause for our guests. All right, so we're here at SpeakuP Monday every Monday at Tropical Nomad. 6 o'clock or 6:30 we go live, or 6:25 actually. So tonight, as you know, it's SpeakuP Monday, Destination Indonesia. So for those of you just tuning into Indonesia, just keep in mind the following. You're talking about a nation voted the most beautiful nation in the world very recently. You're talking about 17,000 plus islands. You're talking about 700 plus cultures. We're talking about 500 plus languages. We're talking about one of the youngest populations in the world for a country of almost 300 million people. In the last election, 60% of the voting population were under 30 years of age. So tonight is really important because, you know, we spent quite a bit of time talking about Bali and Jakarta and so on, but East Indonesia, chairs over here, my darling, over there. East in Indonesia, I know very little about. So I'm really looking forward, you know, to learn more about East Indonesia through Yola Bakker, our guest tonight. And also, you know, what you've been doing there and learning more about this connection between Australia and Indonesia. And we've got a few more takeaways here that I'm just going to let you know. So we have the cultural influences shaping best business practices, the historical trade routes and the need for reconnection and sustainability, economic challenges and opportunities in the information age, and of course, Australian challenges and opportunities with Indonesia. So just before we introduce you or allow you to introduce yourself, just a word for those at home. As you know, my name is Robert Ian Bonnick, the founder of SpeakuP Monday, Destination Indonesia. This is episode 431. Also the founder of RIB and Associates, which is a growth strategist and gateway to Indonesia. So 3 things that we do very quickly. Number 1, for foreign companies who want to enter Indonesia, but also Indonesian companies that want to grow within Indonesia. Number 1 is that we create these feasibility studies where you get to meet the people in your industry, the change makers, the stakeholders, the disruptors, to get a really good understanding of what's happening in your industry from the ground up, all the nuances. Number 2 is that then we connect you to your customer, to your end user, by creating strategic partnerships where necessary, or we create the community for you. And thirdly, we have this wonderful platform which allows us organic engagement of your product or service with your market. But let's move on to tonight's show. So look, Yola, I remember we sat down a while ago, and the thing that really inspired me about you is that, you know, you're a person who's deeply connected to her roots. And that's both Moluccan as well as Australian, Indonesian Australian as well, Aboriginal. So maybe just to start us off, can you explain to us, you know, a little bit about your background, where you've come from, and what do you identify with? Because you have 2 things going on here. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Robert. I appreciate that introduction, and it was great to hear you rattle off all of those phenomenal facts about Indonesia, because Indonesia is absolutely at the forefront in terms of how global economies are moving at the moment. So myself, I had the privilege of being born in Darwin, in the top end of Australia. From very young, I was very connected to country in terms of my father, who was a bushman, and he lived in the bush and was a critical part to putting in roads, I guess, into communities. And so I had the privilege of living and growing up in Darwin. The Australian population there's only 3% Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, which make up the Australian population. Being in Darwin, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population is actually 40%. So being exposed to the language and the culture and that from a young age on, and constantly being between Indonesia and Australia. So on my mother's side, those Makassan roots, and so hearing the stories firsthand from friends and families in community about how fabric first came from their brothers and sisters across the salt water, how tobacco was introduced, how recipes and spices were introduced. So I always took that knowledge very much for granted. I thought that was very widely known.
And what about your Indonesian roots? Because, that's your Australian. So I lived in Australia for 25 years, as you know, loved Australia, lived in Sydney mainly, and got a chance to really work for 5 years with a tribal warrior as a mentor, and had an incredible experience there in Redfern and so on. But so Indonesia, you've been coming and going for many years. So explain that piece to everybody so they get that other side of you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So as an Indonesian Australian or Australian Indonesian, I was just constantly, I either had family that was staying with us from Indonesia, or I was in Indonesia, either studying or living with family. And from a very young age, it was embedded within me that anything, I've been working since the age of 13, and I remember doing that very first 3-hour shift, I knew that with that first pay, and I think it was all of $21, that I would have to buy rice for my grandmother back in Makassar. And so, paying it forward, and if you eat, I eat, that being very much the sort of the principle ingrained within me.
So let's go in a little bit about your entrepreneurial roots, because this is forming quite a strong part of tonight's discussion. So maybe if you can share some insights with us of your company, what it does, because I love what it does. But please, let everyone here know that side of you as well.
So my background is creative industry. I was always a dancer. What I love about creative industry is how much it aligns with indigenous values and that capacity for safe fail space. And so I guess hearing you talk about your company and how you connect people wanting to come and set up foreign companies and set strategies and connect to the customer, I guess our version of that is we like to illuminate sort of the pieces that maybe aren't being seen in terms of, okay, how can we reconnect the dots in terms of the history that may not necessarily be heroed here? How is it that we can centre our business around local knowledge and the indigenous people of that particular place? Because if we're able to do that, and Aboriginal culture shows us, indigenous culture shows us all over the world, that spearheads sustainability. And so if we can, at every single opportunity throughout our strategy or throughout the project delivery or throughout whatever it may be cognizant of bringing that into the fold at every opportunity possible, then we start to very quickly tick off the boxes as needed around the issues that we're facing now in this world around sustainability, whether it's economic, whether it's the wellness of community, the capacity of community, just knowledge sharing and what that does for the communities and people that engage with that.
There's such a great chemistry between, the more we look into indigenous cultures, South Africa is Ubuntu. I am because you are, right? We exist because of each other. Here in Indonesia, gotong royong, the community coming together to solve a community challenge or a challenge facing that community. So just to pick up on a few things. So LANAH.com is the name of your company, right? So LANAH, right? .com. And the thing which I love about it is that what you're saying as well is that you work throughout multiple industries, and where your sweet spot is that you find ways to champion the indigenous roots of that culture into and through enterprise, right? And social enterprise, for example. So at the same time, then from what I can hear, then is that you're blending kind of the best of maybe this Australian heritage, along with the indigenous roots within it, into this, into the Indonesian side. So if I could ask you, which part would you say that each aspect of you in those two areas of Australia and Indonesia, how do they come together to help somebody excel?
So I think from an Australian perspective, it was more so the challenge that I felt like I was confronting, or we were confronting, as minority people in any given place, but particularly in Australia. Yeah. In comparing Australia to the stats and facts that you shared about Indonesia, Australia is doing it really tough in terms of the levels of unwellness, depression, suicide, domestic violence against women, people living from pay to pay, industries falling over, a population which is growing older. We're experiencing the highest level skills shortage in history. Indonesia, everything that Indonesia produces, Indonesia consumes. You only have to spend one day in Indonesia to really appreciate that the app that you're using, or the coffee that you're consuming, it's all locally produced, innovated, manufactured. Yeah. Whereas in Australia, everything is imported. And I think COVID really brought that to the forefront. And I think it was in the face of sort of unpacking all of that challenge where I really realised that, yes, absolutely, Indonesia, like we know in this room, Indonesia is critical to how Southeast, the region plays out in the next 5, 10, 20, 50 years. And what you're constantly fighting within Australia, I guess, is a controlled narrative around what everything needs to look like, because it's systemically, the colonial systems which have been brought in. And so reflecting on how Indonesia and Australia experienced colonisation and the impact of that on people, particularly during that downtime in COVID, as AI comes in heavy and fast, and blockchain and smart contracts, everything that Web3 brings, we really do need to go back to our cultural roots, because that's really all that we have in terms of putting our children through education. It becomes an obsolete, moot point when all of this is going to be picked up. I think I read somewhere it was something ridiculous, like 400 million jobs will be lost in the next 2 or 3 years. And if we look at the link between, so we'll go back to the historical piece, Aboriginal people and the Makassan, the people right through Indonesia, prior to the colonisation of what we know now is Australia, there was a 500-year trade treaty that was in place that was mutually beneficial. It was cohesive. It was prosperous. And the Makassans were bringing in the tripang, the sea slugs, not to sell to Aboriginal people. It was actually to sell to the Chinese. So these links go all the way up. And right there is proof in the pudding that Indigenous people know how to do international advocacy. They know how to do international trade and investment. We know how to do all of that in a way that benefits all, rather than what we generally experience in Western cultures, which is a very extractive approach. And so our brothers and sisters in Australia, there's no escaping it. I have the privilege, and it was very sad when a very good friend of mine said, "Yola, you're so lucky, you can jump on a plane and actually go home." I'm home, but I can't escape the racism. I can't escape the inequities. I have to conform to a certain way of being, or I sink, and so there's no other option. Yeah.
You know, one thing which comes up, and we were here before, and as I look around the room here, it's a good mix of different skin tones. Let's put it like that. And, you know, what we were speaking about earlier on was like, you know, this unity in diversity, which is a motto of Indonesia, you know, how at the core root of everything, we have this opportunity to come together and to do some great things together. And that's why we're here actually, right? So from that perspective, you know, why did you decide to set up LANAH? Because, you know, again, that is empowering remote communities, indigenous communities, but utilizing and powered by a unity and diversity approach. So maybe one way to answer this question, not meaning to lead you too much, is maybe give us an example of where LANAH, like a case study, of where LANAH basically used its resources to come in and to help empower the local and indigenous culture to have success in maybe a business environment, for example. Yeah.
So how I came to set up LANAH, I wanted something that was versatile and something that could move in different industries, because I'd involved myself in so many different types of work, and I reached a point financially where I'm like, okay, so I've done this, and this, but it's not really doing it for me. So how, to assess how to make it more meaningful and more impactful, I guess, in spaces needing it the most. The most recent would have been on our mother island in Seram, where there's very little, I guess, in terms of accessibility to services or information even, but everybody's holding smartphones. And so we wanted to reconnect Indigenous elders between Australia and, these remote parts of East Indonesia. And so that's what we did. And I really didn't have to do anything. Just by holding the space for people to come together and have really critical conversations around lost connections, around music, around food, was really moving. And it brought all of the elders within the community together to really ask some critical questions about their own future in terms of what the development of that community looks like. And so simultaneously I was able to watch in the background, watch problems be put on the table, but at the same time, active problem solving for what was needed to move that forward. And so we went down the path of ecotourism, and with running in parallel to that, an appreciation and a realisation for the fact that the only thing that we have to sell really is our adat, is our culture. And selling off parcels of land or, cutting down trees or whatever it is actually not the way forward. But, when you're dealing with isolated Indigenous groups, you're constantly... It's always... mind-blowing what the impacts of whitewashing and colonisation, how far-reaching that is into any given community.
One thing you said earlier on about, what was it? So you said about, as technology comes in, and you gave that stat of the amount of jobs which will be lost, taken, engulfed, whichever word you want to use, the only way is to go back, meaning... how do we kind of rely on our ancient culture, our indigenous cultures, to kind of rebalance us, connect back to the land, right? Which, again, Indonesian, Aboriginal, South Africa. It's all about the land. The land and the people are one, right? So then in East Indonesia, in the areas that you've been working, how have the indigenous cultures been maintaining their link to the roots?
Yeah, it's an ongoing piece of work, and it is very much about going back to basics. So storytelling, for example, when we brought over Aboriginal elders on various trips to connect and talk about different things, whether it was talking about agriculture or whether it was talking about tourism or health. It was in that storytelling process because one Indigenous culture could speak to direct experience, and it was almost like an advisory kind of exchange. So you're taking away that middle person who is controlling the narrative for their own use, really. And I think moving forward, yes, whilst we've got all of these changes in the economy, it poses as huge opportunity as well, because we're seeing a lot of power go back to the people. I mean, blockchain and digital currencies is a perfect example of that. And it's the way of doing business where it's so transactional and it's quite rigid. It's becoming less about that, and people are you walk into a room now and it's not what do you do for a living, it's who are you. That's shifted so strongly in the last few years. And I think there's a shift in energy in terms of patriarchal and colonial, archaic kind of systems. It's just not resonating with people the way that it was, because people are seeking connection. And like you said, for that connection to be, you need to go back. You need to go back. And when you're talking about ancient cultures, well, if they were able to sustain for as long as they were, then that's what we're going back to. And so like in the village, in an Indonesian village, the sense of power never sat with one individual. Power shifted around the village based on what your strength was and what it is that you brought to the table, whether it was the cooking, whether it was the looking after the kids, whether it was going out to hunt, whether it was to plant or harvest, whatever the case may be. But the power constantly shifted. It never sat with one individual. And we're seeing that in the way, this is a beautiful example of it here in this working space. There is a shift. And so it will go the way that it's going. And I think as well, matriarchal, feminine economies will come to the surface. And Indonesia is unbelievable for amazing women doing amazing things. Yeah.
Now, there's a guy, John Meacham. He's an author. He's an historian as well in the US. So he wrote a book. I didn't bother reading the book, but I watched the HBO documentary. So you can watch a HBO documentary. It's called Soul of America. Okay? Powerful. So the two things I want to draw from that. So number one is this understanding that we feel quite often that we're in a situation that is we've never been before. Unprecedented is a word that keeps being thrown around. This is a guy to say, well, okay, is it really? And then he'll say, well, if you look back at 1361, 1705, 1699, 1960, 14, and he'll basically go in and describe the situation that happened in that time. And it runs off of this premise that, history doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme, right? And you see the same thing, right? That's one. The second one is this, what we are feeling, and the conversation we had before is that in some areas now you have this, if I disagree with you, back in the day, we can still go out for a beer, England, right? But now if I disagree with you, I don't want to see you, get out of my sight, right? So we have these differences, these polarizations that put us diametrically opposed with each other. So what he's saying is there's a three-step process, which can inspire our leaders, but also we are our own leaders too. So it cuts both ways. So the first step is curiosity. So if you're sitting opposite, standing next to a person who has a different view to you and you don't like it very much, right? First thing is just put that aside for a moment, the fact you don't like it, put it aside. And then curiosity. So ask questions. So why is it that this person opposite me holds that view so strongly? What happened in their life? Which events? At which times that led them, if we are a product of the way we grew up, then what events happened to them that put them in a place where all they see is red, or whichever color they're seeing, right? That's the first thing, curiosity. The second one then is humility. Because then if you can understand that, hey, this person has gone through these experiences, had I have been the same in their shoes, I would turn out probably the same way, if not worse, right? Humility. And then the third one is compassion. So it really is a road to compassion, because when you understand curiosity, why this person is the way they are. Humility, knowing that if I was that person in their shoes, I would have the same point of view that they're sharing with me now. And compassion can only be that. So then you reach a point where you don't necessarily have to agree with this person who you disagreed with entirely before, but maybe you get to a point where it's like, you know what? Maybe they have a point. So, and this is the start of where we can actually now talk, actually communicate. I'm not trying to defend myself. I'm not trying to attack you. I'm just trying to understand. So given that, being around some of the most ancient cultures in the world, you know, like how do you, when you're standing across from someone who's diametrically opposed to you, because you have a tremendous and beautiful gift. You have the wisdom of ancient cultures in two different places, which is the same place. But then you also have the upbringing in a place that many people look at as being one of the most modern places and the lucky country, right? So then how do you kind of deal with situations where people have an opposing viewpoint to you? What do you do?
It's truth. It's truth. And everything that you've just described in terms of curiosity, kindness, and compassion is embedded within every Indigenous culture. Yeah. And I think I've become more accepting that sometimes people, they're not ready to hear the message, but it doesn't mean that we don't deliver the message. Because there's this fallacy when we talk about change, there's this perception, I think, sometimes that we go in and there needs to be this complete upheaval. And that's not the case at all. If everybody, again, is able to be open and curious and exercise compassion and kindness with one another, there's more capacity straight away, straight off the bat, there's more capacity to be able to, and that's all we need to do is shift 1-2 degrees left or right. And if everybody has scope to be able to do that, which we all do, yeah. And so not having any preconceived, I guess, not projecting any preconceived ideas about what any kind of conversation, any kind of planning session, any kind of project needs to look like. And trusting the creative process. And that's why I'm always very passionate about it, using creative process. Everything that I sort of learnt. I guess schooling has a lot to answer for, and I don't call it schooling, I call it more conditioning. School hasn't changed since the Industrial Revolution, yet look at all of the changes that we've experienced in the last 10, 15 years, as a species. And so education is key, and I guess in my being a mother, driving home the message that education happens everywhere. It's not within the four walls of a classroom. And so what does that look like in your lived day-to-day experience? And so I very much, again, there's this whole rhetoric around work-life balance, which very much exists within Australia. It's not, it's just life. It's just life. And so very much involving children within the space that we're working with, families. It's not this or the other.
So we're going to be coming very soon, in about next 5-10 minutes, to questions. So if you have any questions forming in your mind, feel free to write them down, and then we'll give you a microphone over there, and it will come to you. By the way, when you get that chance to ask a question, these microphones, just point them towards your mouth. All right, towards your mouth. Everyone, each week we go this, but each week someone gets it and they go, can't hear you. So just watch out for that. So, okay, so we've been a little bit through the background of you, the background of LANAH, why it existed. We've kind of dabbled a little bit into this cultural. We had a guest on a few weeks ago, and we broke things down into socio-cultural, socio-economic, and socio-political. And I think we've covered maybe one or two of those at the moment. So we've taken our journey through that. You've kind of explained to us how you think and how you feel and why you do this. You've explained to us as well how you can grasp some of the learnings and teachings, from this indigenous culture, both of them, to basically propel you forward, and how you use that as well as as like a springboard, to launch, to help, to support other indigenous peoples coming through in their journey. Could be entrepreneurial journey in multiple industries, right? Okay, got that bit. Good. So the second part then is, where is this going, right? So that's the background, but where is, and the present too, but where is the future going? So if I ask you, if you could go through maybe 3 points, if you have that many, what would you like to see in this area of East Indonesia in the next 5-10 years and so on? What is it you would like to see happen? And what do you think needs to happen for that to happen?
I think in the next 5 to 10 years, it's absolutely around land use, land ownership, land management, and empowering locals within the groups that we're... So without wanting to name those groups, because we've put different proposals forward, and we're working through different pieces, but looking at generating systems, not us generating them, but locals generating those systems, so that the management of that land moving forward can very much stay within the people of that community, and is conversations across Indigenous groups can occur where it's been cut off for whatever reasons, whether it's isolation or just history has played out, and so certain groups have been cut off. So making that reconnection so that the conversations can continue to happen. The World Economic Forum has also shifted focus towards Indigenous best practice. So it's interesting to see where this is popping up in terms of its place within economies moving forward, and what practices need to look like moving forward. So 5-10 years, I think for us, we would like to be championing agreements that locals can proudly say that they are driving and managing and using for future generations, particularly in isolated islands, and how also being able to categorically identify how that contributes to the tapestry that is Indonesia, that diversity in Indonesia. It's not a separate piece to it. The reason why we can have Bhinneka Tunggal Ika is because of the diversity. So we absolutely need to hero the diversity, otherwise there's no point in us talking about unity.
I mean, do you feel, just popped in, that East Indonesia has been forgotten to a certain extent? I mean, or do you feel,
Yeah, absolutely. Similar to regional parts in Australia, regional parts in East Indonesia, the travel is double the price. Services are poor and in between. Education, access to education. So yeah, absolutely. There's health issues. We've got a lot of stunted growth in our communities. So it is, and that's why the focus on Eastern Indonesia, because apart from the fact that that's where my people are based. But there's so much to offer in terms of that rich culture. But at the same time, a lot of work and awareness around the fact that those systems are not in place. So effectively, people are like sitting ducks. And if we don't come in, individuals here in this room who do have roots in those areas, but we've had the capacity, we've got the privilege to be able to come to Bali or Australia or wherever the case may be, to be able to take that knowledge back and share our skills and our knowledge, whatever the connection pieces are that we can activate, absolutely take responsibility to do so and align it with whatever work that we're doing in whatever industry that may be in. I come from a property investment background and working in native title. So what are all of the elements from that I can draw upon to use for my people and offer it up with the cleanest heart possible.
There's everyone here heard of a term called UGC? Just raise your hand if you heard of the term UGC. All right, put your hand up if you have not heard of the term UGC. Just raise your hand, don't be shy. There you go, you're halfway there. All right, thank you. User-generated content, right? User-generated content. So what's coming up is like LGS, right? Locally generated solutions. You can use that, by the way. You heard it here first, folks. So locally generated solutions, got it, right? Yeah. And okay, so there's another aspect I want to speak about, which is about the economic opportunity. But before we get there, is there any questions that anybody has so far? Feel free just to raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. Don't be shy. I know that Daddy has a question, but he's just being polite. Don't be polite, brother. Just ask your questions, man. So just give Guzman a minute just to mic you up. Yeah.
Yola, thank you so very much. I've learned a lot, and just beautiful, like a lot of insights and germs, all this beautiful statement also, that I wrote down. And so my questions around what you said, education happens everywhere. I really like that. Would it be possible or to share ways on how we can spread that if education's everywhere is what are the things that me as being local and in here and I also come in contact with a lot of people from all over the world and to educate around what I love the mindset, how you see the world, how you see the relationship between indigenous people, and so I'm just wondering, in my case, being local here in Indonesia, what would be the education that I can kind of spread through the work that I do? So, thank you.
He has, by the way, Daddy has an incredible school. Yeah, so his question also comes from the fact that the next generation is in his hands. Part of the next generation is in his hands. So great question, brother.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate that feedback and that question. There is so much. Australia and Indonesia are neighbours, yet they couldn't be more far apart in terms of understanding. Okay? I think the fact, and I just use this as an example, the fact that we're based here in Bali, and it blows me away, what other place in the world can you witness, the number of, the diversity in terms of industry and ethnicities, all kind of, coming to one place and working together and sharing and eating together, whatever the case may be. But the reality is anywhere you go in the world, all of the issues that we're facing, when you peel it right back, it stems from the seed of colonisation. And so it's less about I think it's less about layering on top levels of education, but more about peeling back the layers of the onion to understand how people are coming into a space. And again, what you mentioned, you know, what is being able to differentiate between culture and conditioning. But going back to the Australia and Indonesia piece, we have so much education that we need to do with our own people, because there's 100% a perception, and you can see it starting to change, but there's a perception among our people, particularly those that are in the East and are more isolated, that West knows best, and that Westerners, you know, have the right way of doing things. And it's empowering our own people to say, no, actually they don't, because look at all the problems that they're having back home. And they are. We've got huge problems, but Australia likes to put forward a certain front, and it's not. It's about being really honest with ourselves, and that includes with our own people. And so I can say that, because I can say, yes, I was born over there, and this has been my experience. In my 30, 40 years in Australia, while it afforded me X, Y, and Z, it absolutely came at a cost. And so no, West does not know best. And so there's that, but then it's Westerners who are coming in to any given culture being super mindful of the fact that, yes, you are on sacred land. And, Bali, I speak to Bali because we're here in Bali. The spirituality of place and how quickly karma happens in any given spiritual place. And not being shy to speak to those elements which come naturally to us as being local to I'm a visitor of Bali. I'm not local to Bali. So I'm very cognizant of making sure that I centre around my Balinese staff, and if there's anything that I need to cross-check, or that I also drive that education with my staff, who, whilst they might be Indonesian, but they're from different areas of Indonesia, driving that understanding, and that, because that's all education about the fact, if we're going into a different place, then we need to source information that is absolutely local and respect that and sit equitably to share in that information. And those are conversations, those are conversations that we need to be having with our children from a very young age. And we get caught up when we talk about economic opportunity. I think we get caught up in most Western narratives around what the bottom line is, because, we've got this tangible thing called money now, which predicates whether or not we eat tomorrow or not, which was never the case previously. And in Indigenous cultures, that relationship with money is very different. The concept of ownership is very different. And so it's, putting that understanding forward to make people who may not necessarily have had the privilege that you and I have had with our people, and that understanding with our people, but we have contact with people from European and Western cultures day in and day out. So making sure that we have those conversations day in and day out, and I stick steadfast to that. It doesn't always make you friends, but it's about doing what's right, and it's integrity, and it's not about you and me. It's about who are we looking over our shoulder for the people, our people who are less privileged than us, what it is that we do with our privilege day in and day out to ensure that we're keeping them in mind, and they also have a pathway forward in whatever area that may or may not be.
It's such an important conversation, this one. There's a few people here who have been here for quite a few weeks, and there are times where we have some very, I think the most we've had is about 150 people or something for a blockchain thing. That was early on in the year. But here's the thing. What we're talking about today, to me, is one of the most important topics that we'll ever speak about, actually, right? Because at the core of it, it drives everything else. Who are you as a person? Because it's people that inspire people. And so the message from today that I'm already feeling, which I kind of had a feeling that's what connected us in the first place, is about that, right? So how can we actually remember where we're from and bring some of those better values through to allow us to be healthier in the present. So we have Health Hub Bali, which is once a month, which is, it's a health tourism initiative, very powerful one. And we started that one about 25 months ago. So over 2 years ago, we started that. And the first episode was, why are we living longer, but we're sicker?
Yeah.
Right? That was where we started. And then we went through to the future of health, the future of medicine, and conversations that mattered 2024. And one of the most important episodes in that was with a guy called Professor Gelgel Wirasuta. Professor Gelgel Wirasuta, Balinese, obviously. And so, interesting man. He got his toxicology degree from the US. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the governor appointed him as the highest authority in Bali on traditional Balinese medicine and traditional Balinese wellness. So I asked him in one of the questions that we had, I said, Professor Gelgel, and he's a good guy, like he's fun as well, he's cheeky too. And I asked him, what is one of the biggest determinants of health that people miss? Right? What is one of the biggest determinants of health that people miss? Because people allow, medicine, drugs, this, that. He said, Rob, it's the way you think. Yeah. It's the way, and that's what most people miss. So you can think yourself into wellness, you can think yourself into dis-ease, you can think yourself into dis-wellness, if there's ever such a word, right? So what we're talking about today is reconnecting to our roots. Ancient, those which are indigenous, because they had a connection to the land and a connection to the people that in some ways we've kind of lost. So that's the reason why this conversation is one of the most important ones that we're going to have, right? So then the question to you, and then we'll go back to the audience, is if there was one thing that you could pass on to the next generation coming through, and we'll talk about your hometown in a minute, what would it be? If there was one piece of advice that you would pass on to the next generation coming through, knowing what you know today, what would it be?
How can you know where you're going if you don't know where you've come from? And it's funny that you mentioned that around the health piece, we're living longer, but because I actually heard the flip side of that several weeks ago, and it was in jest around the table, and one of my Indonesian counterparts said, we may not live as long, but at least we're happier. At least our quality of life is there. And it's true. And we no longer, I think as well, an understanding that, particularly in a Western construct, we're no longer living in communities in Western constructs. We're actually living in corporations on steroids. And so where and how you spend your money, the decisions that you make in terms of what you're consuming, whether that's your scrolling, your social media feed, the food that you're putting into your body, the music that you play, the clothes that you choose to put on your body, the people that you choose to make eye contact with or not, or they are all very conscious choices, giving permission for that consciousness from a very young age, and making sure that there is an understanding that consciousness is able to thrive through the curiosity and the exploration and the imagination, because that's what school conditions out of students from a very young age. And so going, maybe just bringing it back to sort of some of our efforts at the moment, the ecotourism which came about, it was yes, anybody can come to any given place and go to the zoo and go to the beach and surf, and but how is it that we connect communities so that more meaningful, because meaningful conversations actually happen effortlessly, provided there is a consciousness around the choice that is being made. So Give Back Getaways is one of our enterprises, and it is ordinary people, extraordinary outcomes. By just waking up and doing what it is that we do naturally, but in a more, in a more considered way.
Next week's show, right, we have a guy, his name is David Shrier, right? He's one of the leading futurists in the world. So David Shrier, check him out, Shrier, right? And AI, it's going to be another great conversation. But what you're telling me now is this conversation, which is very sobering. Tonight's show already for me has been a sobering show, reminding me of something which I needed to remember. And I think everyone else who's watched it will feel the same. But I'm going to ask him the same thing next week of how do you bring a level of awareness, a level of authenticity into that environment which but can take us away and divorce us from ourselves in some ways. Others may argue that technology, if used correctly, can also improve our connection to self and our connection to our ancestral roots, right? Okay, so any more questions? Because I've got about 10 minutes left. 2 other questions in my head. But if you have any questions, feel free. If not, it's okay. All right. Yes, so Brother Detlev, over to you.
Let's say what I get from this evening is a certain awareness, what I hear. But I do not hear the way for results. So what is going on then in Australia? On one hand, for the, let's call it the white community, what have the problems of the demography? And then you have you called it the bush people before. So what is your impact? What you change that things getting better?
So I made the conscious decision 2 years ago to shift our investment and our assets and bring it across to Indonesia after spending some time working in native title, which was a very interesting area to work in. It was around working with locals and negotiating with how mining companies access and use land. I'll repeat what I said before, in Australia, in terms of, so we do quite a bit of advocacy and working with groups one-on-one, but in terms of change that's needed moving forward, it's why we made the decision to come across to Indonesia. Because when we brought Indigenous elders and did that reconnection, and some of the feedback that we received from Indigenous leaders and community leaders in Australia, upon arriving in Indonesia, it was the realisation that, there actually is another way of being. There actually are systems that are more aligned to how we work. But it was impossible to see that within Australia because of lots of the division and polarisation that occurs in Australia. So lots of the issues that I mentioned, I would say no, there's very little change. To be very honest, there's very little change. And we saw that with the no vote in Australia with the referendum. And it's because all of the issues are politicised and they're used as, they're weaponised. And it's sad because ultimately those that pay are the people in community who are already extremely marginalised. And so for me, it was now a strong focus to reconnect people into Indonesia. And that's the short answer. It's just continuing.
You're not satisfied. Come on, mate. Keep going. Keep going. She can't go anywhere.
I would not give up on things all over the world. I mean, what we see through COVID, what we see now, politically, on one hand, there is whatever black and white is more visible than ever before, but on the other hand, we see these small steps that, and this is maybe a chance for Australia as well. We see these small steps all over the world that production coming back to the country where it comes from. So it's not all only trading. You remember, the trading thing is this what causes a lot of trouble in the world. And we see this in America, how they kind of getting healthier and healthier from the economic point of view. We see it even in, I thought I do not hear right, but even in Germany, companies starting producing garment by themselves again. They don't outsource it, they're doing it by themselves. And I think that's a big chance all over the world. On the other hand, the demography is a killer then, because where you want to get your clients for this, what you produce. And there, Indonesia is a winner.
That's right. There has been efforts, actually, I shouldn't completely, the last 2 years I did spend time, the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs did embed within its department an ambassador for First Nations people. So absolutely, there are efforts being made, don't get me wrong. But again, it's efforts being made. So what I was saying before, the frustration that I felt, I guess, from more of a conscious standpoint, is the fact that Australia is experiencing this identity crisis, okay? The DNA of Australia is black, the systems are white, and then we've got immigration that has, come in and also very much been a part of building the country. So everybody is, within that, a part of the story. And it was Noel Pearson that sort of put that in a much more eloquent way. The problem that I have with that statement is that when you say it the way that I've just said it, there's a perception that there's equality across those, in terms of the power that each of those demographics holds within Australia, and that's just not the case. The reality is where the power sits is obviously within the systems. So until the systems can start to shift, and while, the government prefers to politicise for their own benefit, and look, straight off the bat, I'm neither left or right or Liberal or Labor. To me, they're both just, wings of the same bird, the same beast. So efforts are being made, but I feel like it is also, if Australia is going through that identity crisis, then it's also part of the journey. It has to go through that motion to be able to end up where it needs to end up. Where does Indonesia sit in all of this? And that's why going back to history is so critical, because going back to that story piece can facilitate so much in terms of healing, in terms of, moving forward through to the other side of where we need to be so that everybody can sit fairly at the table and participate equally in the economy. Like Indonesia, 9 million middle-class workers emerging every single year. So that is sitting on the doorstep of Australia, but Australia is not tapping into that. I think it believes that it is. It's not at all, yeah.
We've had 2 doctors recently in, I think, the last 4 weeks. So one was Dr. Subowo Musa, who Detlef was referencing, and that was, he is head of the MBA program at Swiss German University, which is the oldest international university in Indonesia. And we spoke about kind of like the future of Indonesia from an economic standpoint, 3 standpoints: socioeconomic, socio-cultural, and socio-political. And that's what you were saying before about this this manufacturing creator mindset versus one which is consuming or trading, right? And where the opportunity lies for Indonesia is turning a little bit more towards a creator, okay? Divergent thinking, like here is a glass, I can just buy it, or I can figure out how is this glass made and make one in Indonesia and then sell that. Just like Apple, America, Samsung, South Korea, and so on, right? The other doctor we had 2 weeks ago was Dr. Melanie Ryback. So she was an incredible lady. She's voted one of the 9 most innovative women in the European Union. And what she brings is this next generation of entrepreneurism, which she calls next generation social enterprise. And that show was all about, not all about, but aspects of that show, brilliant, another brilliant, because she was, and she's another person who's put her money where her mouth is. So she's in the cybersecurity industry. She built a company, one of the largest companies in Europe, I believe. And while her counterparts were selling their share and cashing out for tens of millions, she sold her company for $1. 90% of the profit goes away. Just a very, not different, but a very divergent way of thinking, which was, again, sobering. And I think both of these, as does this one, I love thinking in threes anyway, hold a clue and a piece of the puzzle for figuring out how we go and where we go next in terms of how do we grow economically within the premise of getting the socio-cultural right, or as right as we can get it, as well as the socio-political and the socio-economic. So this is, I think, interesting how these pieces are beginning to come together because, and I agree with what you're saying, Detlef, and I agree with what you're saying in that where you look around the world, you take a cursory glance around the world, you see people just popping up, as you said, right? And as you've said, popping up saying, how about we see it like John Meacham, Soul of America. Brilliant doc. You should watch it. It's brilliant, right? And again, these other 2 doctors that we've had over the last 4 weeks. Next week, as I mentioned, David Shrier, who is one of the leaders in the world of futurists. So how the future is going to be using AI and everything else, right? So looking forward to that conversation. So we're getting these pieces, like pieces of a jigsaw, as I mentioned before. So the last 2 questions that pop in my mind is because some people are saying, well, Maluku, what is it? Where is it? So the question is, so obviously it's Eastern Indonesia, we've got that. But what are, if I could ask you economically speaking now, so what are the raw materials or what is it that makes Maluku just prime for economic activity going forwards? Yeah.
So historically, the Moluccan Islands were known as the Spice Islands. Yeah. So the Spice Islands were critical while the Dutch were here. We produce huge amounts of nutmeg, mace, cloves, eucalyptus oil, cocoa. And again, going back to what was, it's relinking and sharing in some of that adversity because of what our people in Maluku experienced post Indonesian independence, the decolonisation war, and so 13,000 of our people were actually taken to Holland and promised it was unwanted repatriation, and so they were completely displaced and continue to live to this day. And so again, it's that reconnection, and for me, the economic opportunity that I'm interested in are for Indigenous groups to be able to, because there's a shared value system in terms of how we care for our livestock, how we grow our food, how we just do business in general. And so that's what I'd like to kind of, illuminate in that regard. But secondly, I think economic opportunity, what's the opportunity? It's the opportunity to explore different ways of doing business. to explore ways of doing business better in ways that are more inclusive, trusting that the bottom line will follow if we act with integrity and prioritise place and people over profits. Profits will follow. And I can categorically say that that has worked for me. And yeah, I'm comfortable. I'm comfortable in walking away from dollars if it means that it doesn't align with our way of working, and that was part of it as well. Like going back to the Australia piece, I became very cognizant of what I was giving oxygen to, and yeah, if there's certain spaces where we couldn't move the needle, then that's okay. We needed to really shift focus to where we could, and here I am.
Second last question. So you mentioned that you did it and it worked for you, right? Again, prioritizing places and people over profit, right? So can you give us an example of how, because I think that, giving you time to think, personal examples are really powerful, because when we speak as a generalization, we don't really connect with it so much. But when it comes from a personal viewpoint and you can feel it's rooted in that person and it's authentic, then we actually get it. So if you're able to share something that can answer that piece, would be great.
I guess leaving when I left, so I'd walking away from self-sustaining investment portfolio, which I'd built literally from the ground up, and making the decision to say no, I'm shifting that across and diversifying our enterprise into Indonesia, and yeah. With our team in the last 6 months, it's been a bit of a journey, but we've sat in those lessons together, and I can proudly say that within our staff we're able to support single mothers, for example, or empower young women who haven't had access to certain education opportunities or certain upskilling opportunities. And so next month we're heading over to Surabaya because we've been offered to open up a third premise over there. And so it flows. It's not forced. I don't feel like I have to pursue business. Don't feel like I have to pursue or push. It flows easily because people identify the value that exists within a way of doing something, and that it isn't purely just about X, Y, Z. It's holistic. Yeah.
All right. So you almost answered it. You're really close. So one step further. So. Okay, so you had an investment portfolio that you basically grew from scratch.
Yep.
So that investment portfolio, if you don't mind me asking, if there are 3 or 4 areas that it was focused in, real estate?
Yep. Absolutely, it was in real estate, and it was across all parts of Australia.
Great.
And I made the call to say, no, let's diversify and come over to Indonesia, and we did that.
So you're keeping those or you're selling those?
No.
So you cashed out.
We cashed out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
100%. We cashed out.
Got it.
And we're focusing here now, and so that we've got. Yeah.
Beautiful. So okay, good.
Yeah.
So got there, cashed out there, bringing it here.
In majority, yeah.
In majority.
Yeah.
And then what are you focused on here to invest in?
So we've got a enterprise. We've got a couple of enterprises in Kuta, in the form of cafe, restaurants, and salon.
Great. So hospitality industry.
Yep. And we are doing a villa build.
Yeah.
But yeah, working with some phenomenally inspiring Balinese contractors. And moving into Surabaya with another one, and so, and in eastern Indonesia.
And they're more real estate, hospitality type. When you say moving in.
Oh, hospitality.
Yeah.
And in eastern Indonesia, we run it's Happy Green World. It's an green educational program. Okay. So profits from our enterprise are used to support our waste bank program, green education within schools. We had that translated into local language with locals, and are looking at getting it done into Balinese for local schools here.
That makes it clear, I think, for people here as well, that you're diversified into hospitality, real estate generally, and then what you've done is that you've brought that here, and then you're investing here to set up certain types of, some hospitality, some, as you mentioned, were real estate, but there was another one which was different to that, right? What was it?
Which one was that? Well, we've got substantial ancestral land.
There you go.
Okay, back in Seram, and so looking at permaculture moving forward on those lands rather than because it's been cleared and it sits on the cusp of rainforest. So looking at ways that again locals can develop that in a way that generates profits back into the community.
And then you mentioned as well, thank you. Then you mentioned as well that along the way you've been empowering women. So can you just talk just a little bit into that, how you've been empowering women, and then we'll get to the last question after that.
So that's been that's from Australia, that's been happening. So really kind of unpacking, it's specifically around financial literacy, but unpacking rather than giving women the tools to learn how to save or, pay bills or this, that or the other, but really unpacking the relationship that we have with money and where that stemmed from. So financial
program. Education, financial literacy,
yes.
Empowering women along the way. I love it. Okay. And then the final question will be, going forward, how can people support or empower you, meaning the projects and the initiatives that you're doing? What would you say? And remember, people are watching over here as well, and they'll watch this maybe on replay. So how can people or organizations empower what you're doing?
There's so many ways to support us.
Think of 3.
Partner with us. Come in and use our services and connect with us that way. Book a give back getaway. There are 2025 dates coming up soon.
So great. So LANAH, LANAH.com.
.co.
I knew that. .co, right? When it was almost there. We're very close.
Good.
LANAH.co. That was staring me in the back of my ear. Okay, that's one. And you said 2 others about the trip to gift back.
Yep.
Explain
so
that.
if on our website, if you hit, there's a section for enterprise, and you'll see there where our outlets are and how to book. You can actually book tours online into eastern parts of Indonesia and connect with our indigenous cultures. We do very small, intimate groups, but we take you right into the rainforest, and it's it's special. Straight onto our sacred lands, and
So, and that's kind of like an ecotourism model?
Yes, that works with local businesses on the ground. It's all locally led guides, and it's there's a massive national reserve and some of the most unique flora and fauna there is in the world on Seram Island. It's quite spectacular.
We probably should have put some images up here. And then the third one, there were 3. Do you remember the third one?
Was it come in and have a meal with us?
There you go. book a meal.
Have
right?
a meal. Come in and have a meal with us or partner with us. We're always looking for partners and, come in and use our services.
And then last question, I promise the last question. So what kind of partners are you looking for? So I know there's a wide array. Choose one or two and describe what that partner looks like. And I'll give you some time. The reason why I'm doing that is because, when you generalize, it's difficult for people to connect. But when you go direct, this is what we're looking for, this is the makeup, this is the kind of partner, then someone maybe in the audience today or someone watching in that one over here will say, that sounds like me or someone that I know. Right? So describe in whichever amount of detail you think is good, meaning go a bit deeper than what you think. What kind of partners would you love to have on board?
Predominantly those that absolutely have a value alignment. But I think in the onset it would be around education and tourism.
Right there.
Yeah.
That's one.
Yeah.
That's two. All right. So alignment with education and tourism. Values. If I ask you, what are three of your top values or the values of LANAH? I think it's the same. What would you say?
We have several values that off the top of my head, fall under resourcefulness, resilience, being raw and real. Creativity and integrity, curiosity, culture.
You've done really well, darling, and just want to appreciate you. So what I'm going to do is that I'll spend a couple of minutes kind of wrapping up here. And if there's something else, because quite often when you feel like you're on the spot, your brain, you've done well, by the way, but something else might drop in and say, oh, Rob, I want to say that. So I'm going to do this 2-minute thing coming up pretty soon. And if there is something that you also want to add or you want to say, I'll give you the moment. If not, then we'll close it there, okay? All right. So as we begin to wrap up, I think I said that about 3 times. It's okay. They don't mind. So Speak Up Monday, 431. That was this episode. Next week, as I mentioned before, one of the leading futurists in the world, David Shrier, will be sitting in that seat. Looking forward to that one. And we're talking about, the future. Again, it's one of these future-based conversations. So I think it's really interesting to look into this field of technology and how that intertwines with the human aspect of our nature. So next week is going to be all about that. Looking forward to it. Feel free to join us. Remember as well, these episodes, we keep a library on YouTube. So Robert Ian Bonnick or Speak Up, one word, Speak Up Monday on YouTube. You'll get to the library. The last 255 episodes were filmed properly. So you'll be able to see them and really get some good information from each of them. And then RIB and Associates. So if you are either a company within Indonesia that wants to grow within Indonesia, or you're a foreign company looking at entering into Indonesia, feel free to reach out to us. We're there to help. But more specifically, not to set up your business. There's plenty of companies that do that. But to actually plug you into business. That's what separates us from most others out there. What else can I say? Tropical Nomad. So we have Brother Guzman with a super cool haircut, looking handsome as usual, brother. Thank you very much. Sister Ayu, Brother Hadis. Thank you very much indeed to the Tropical Nomad team. Thank you as well for the guests which have coming tonight. Obviously, I'm looking at you, my sister from Maluku. Thank you so much. And Australia, 25 years. You'll love it. Love it, love it. And obviously to our guests which have come here today. So we're looking forward to seeing more of you. Now, just before we wrap up, is there something else that you'd like to share? Up to you.
Only to extend my gratitude and thank you for having me. It's been great to connect with others that have strong connections to Australia and experiences in Australia. Yes, have enjoyed it immensely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Round of applause, please. Thank you, Yola Bakker.